You can move through life and through the changes without naming the grief. But what you lose is an acceptance of the good and an acceptance of the hard. And with that, you lose a quality of enjoyment of life that doesn't happen unless you name what's happening.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Will.
My name is Adam.
And welcome to the Daily Commute Quarantine Conversations. So a commute is an everyday movement from point A to point B. And as followers of Jesus, we have to make a choice every single day to move from living for ourselves towards living for Him. We're on this commute with you, and we're here to empower you and encourage you on your daily commute.
And today we are joined by a very good friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, Meghan Gamble. Hello, Meghan.
Hi.
So just to acquaint yourself a little bit with our listeners, maybe you could share your name, your job, and how long you've been commuting.
Sure. So my name is Meghan, Meghan Gamble, soon to be Megan Gores. I have been a follower of Christ officially since I was 9. I was raised in a Christian home and really believe that I made my faith in my own in high school, though. So I think that's true for a lot of us. So anyway, what I do right now is something called a life skills specialist. So I actually work in a school with kids that have behavior challenges, and I also work with their parents. So I work in the home and with the kiddos in the moment when they're angry, when they're needing help, and we work on something called a skill, which is something most of us are already equipped with, that were raised in good homes. But those that were not raised in good homes with parents that were also not raised with these skills don't have basic things like how to calm down, or teaching parents how to tell their kids how to tell their kids no, or how to set a basic limit, like, no, you can't watch literally 8 hours of TV a day or play 8 hours of video games. So anyway, kind of like a school counselor, really interesting job, really, really fun. Yeah. That's what I do.
That's
awesome.
So cool. That sounds super fun. I mean, I'm sure it's hard, but I
It has
love
its
it.
fun moments, yes.
Yeah. So I have this is probably as deep as we're gonna get the whole episode. If we're talking about loss today. So if you lost both of your hands, what would you replace them with? You can't say fake hand. If you lost both of your hands, something has to go, like something has to replace them. You have to choose something to be your hands. What is it?
It has to be feet. Those are the only thing would anything replace hands. So
I love that.
So you just lost your hands, all right? You're in some accident, you're in the hospital. Where are they gonna get feet?
A cadaver, obviously.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So dead feet.
Preferably from another small human, because I don't want any size 12 feet on these hands.
That is the perfect answer to that question. Of course. What other thing would you want on your hands other than feet?
Understand.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, wow. I wasn't expecting that at all, and it was so quick. Adam, what about you?
Oh man, I don't know. You asked that question, and my mind immediately reverted back to like 10-year-old self, and I was thinking, I would like swords on my hands. Thank you very much. But
Nice.
that's probably not gonna work super well. Man, the feet one though, I can't beat that. I'd probably want one of them to be a pair of tongs, and then
Oh, that's good.
one of them like, I don't
Spatula.
know. Yeah, a spatula. Yeah, I'm just a chef. I'm a full-time
So
chef.
you're ready to cook. Yeah.
I've lost my hands, so now I can finally pursue my dream of being a full-time chef.
Perfect.
So I don't know like what I would prefer that is replacing my hands, but Like, for some reason, when I ask this question, all I can think of in my head is replacing my hands with candles and being like the dude from Beauty and the Beast, you know? Like,
Lumiere.
yeah, his hands are like literally candles, and I've always wondered how that worked. Like, wouldn't the wax just drip off all the time? And I don't know, but I don't know.
You live out your dream, finally. Thanks for that fun question, Will.
Anytime.
But in all seriousness, we are going to be talking a little bit about. I think Will and I were talking about this. There's so many different terms I think you can apply to this conversation. One of them is grief. Loss is another way of talking about it. Just this idea of like, something being missed out on in general, and that form taking so many different shapes and sizes, especially right now in the middle of COVID-19, this quarantine that we're in. And Meghan, I just want to hear from you. I mean, what has this season been like for you?
Oh man. Surrounded in a lot of different things, grief being one of them for sure. Well, we were supposed to get married April 26th. And so for me, it's been surrounded by accepting a different date, accepting that I'm not living with my soon-to-be husband yet, that I'm in between homes. I'm actually living with my parents right now. And so feeling, I'm grieving not being with my students. And I'm actually moving on to teaching next year. And so I'm ending what feels like a long career in this, not with my students or families that I have grown to love and worked in the trenches of their life with. And that's painful to lose.
Yeah.
Grieving not seeing friends for a long time, like most of us. And I think just like anybody, it's hard to measure my grief because we are in a world of grief right now, and some people are accepting the grief, some people are really fighting against the grief. And so it's been interesting to be sitting in this grief. And it's not all grief, it's there's been really good things of learning to be still and learning to be quiet. Adam, which I am good at neither. So that has been an experience of
yeah, I'm sure
just what is there to do today? Nothing. Well, what does nothing mean? Like, you have to do something. No, literally nothing. So that's been interesting. So yeah, that's kind of what my time has been steeping in, if you will.
Yeah. Well, you pointed out a lot of really good things there, and one of them I really quickly want to draw attention back to is that, like, the size and shape of the types of things people are experiencing right now are varying in a lot of different ways. And some people are experiencing a lot more pain and grief right now than I can even comprehend. I mean, even something like what you just shared, Meghan, not being able to have a wedding on the day that you've planned and hoped for and longed for a long time. That is, I mean, that's a lot. And I want to, you brought up this idea of accepting the grief versus fighting it. Just want to ask you about that a little bit. What is that?
Sure. Well, I want to bring a term to your mind. It's called resiliency, and this is something we talk about with our kids a lot. And some kids are far more resilient than adults. So if you notice, the one population of people that isn't complaining during this time at all are the kids. mostly because they don't have a voice on social media. So that's a piece of it. But the ones that do, even the teenagers or the older ones, they aren't angry. They aren't in that stage of anger or denial. They are able to flow with the change, and they're so used to having to follow rules from their parents, or at least they should be, that they are the ones that are least hesitant to follow the rules that the government has put in place, and are what we call the most resilient to this kind of change and this kind of loss that is occurring in this time right now. And so what I see when I see adults protesting or adults throwing tantrums over things that they can't control, over things that are upsetting and that they are grieving over, it's their lack of resiliency. Or they have reached their saturation point with grief, that, we can only handle a certain amount of change and we can only handle a certain amount of loss without Christ. And so those that don't have Christ, honestly, I don't know how they do it in this time. And so what we look at in terms of accepting these kind of things, it's how resilient you are to what comes at you, to the types of things that occur in this life. And if you aren't resilient, those of us who follow Christ, consider that how much are we trusting in Christ during this time? How much can we allow Christ to help us be resilient in this time? We'll end up riding the storm a lot better than those who are not resilient to change or struggle.
That is so good.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I feel like for me, like I think of, I don't know, it seems like there's people are experiencing, we talked about this, people are experiencing completely different kinds of losses. People are losing family members, loved ones, but people are also losing moments, experiences, weddings, and graduations. People and students are losing their senior year, and I mean, a lot of students, even if they're not seniors, I think are struggling with losing the end of the second half of their school year and their friends and stuff like that. And for me, and I feel like maybe there's some other people that are kind of in this same boat, like for those experiences, like when I think of grief, I immediately think of losing a loved one, losing, a family member, something like that. I never think to grieve things that maybe I'm missing out on that are really, really painful. And I think my default is when those things start to hurt, I'm like, no, it's not that big of a deal. Like you're fine, like it's not like someone died. But what's the importance? I think it's clear that grief definitely needs to play a role in losing anything that causes pain, and I think there's something to acknowledging that, like you said, accepting that you are grieving something. Can you like speak on that a little bit? Like why does grief so important?
Well, wow, huge question and great question. Grief, first of all, is something I have grown to be passionate about, and I had no idea that it was even something to be passionate about. Specifically in the life of kids, this is something I'm passionate about, and so forgive me if I bring it back to kids. That's where my experience primarily is.
Keep doing it. Yeah.
But when it comes to the importance of grief, you can't talk about grief without talking about feelings. And our society is so neglectful and prideful of feelings, and how dare you have a big feeling and show it in an appropriate way or without anger, because people don't listen to feelings unless they're loud, unless they're really big. Same is true in school. We actually teach our teachers to look for the kids that aren't having the loud behaviors, but the ones who never talk, the ones who sit silently in the back of the room and appear to have it all together, and those are the ones that we're most concerned about. Same is true for adults to some extent. Obviously, you see the ones that are loud and proud and angry, and they have valid and real feelings. just as much so as the ones who aren't saying anything and who aren't quite sure how to put into words what they're losing and grieving. Without acceptance of your feelings, there is no acceptance of grief. And grief really is the last thing that people tend to accept, because grief is weak and grief is painful. Probably the most painful thing that you can go through, grief of the loss of a child. I just had an old friend from high school lose her mom suddenly through the night. She was 56. And she, she's grieving the best way she knows, I'm sure. I see a lot of her grief through social media. I'm not around her anymore, but you see people like you said, Will, who have lost loved ones in this time. And how do you grieve that? How do you grieve when society isn't letting you grieve the typical way of having a funeral, having that closure? So that's why it's important, is because right now we are not allowed to have communal grief because we can't be together. And so the way our society grieves a lot of times is to gather, talk about the things that we miss about those people or miss about that time. And right now, instead of being able to talk in a healthy way because it's such a mass loss, people are having trouble accepting it quickly. And without accepting it quickly, it just stays in that phase of anger. And it becomes a really unhealthy thing that turns instead from grief to bitterness. And bitterness is not a feeling that we are meant to sit with. Grief is something that is long-term and that changes through the phases of your life, and is something that is made to be sat with for years. If it is dealt with in a healthy way. Bitterness is something that changes your inner self, the way that you perceive others, the way that you perceive the world. Grief does the same thing. Grief changes the way that you perceive the world, the way that you change others, but it should not change the way that you treat others. Bitterness does, which is why it is so important to even just accepting that what you're feeling is grief. Which it's been really interesting to read the pages. Social media right now is the only way that we really have to connect with lots of people at once. And so it's been really interesting to read a lot of people's things, and they're angry. They're talking about, why can't this just happen? And what they're dealing with is grief. And I imagine if they had named grief, sometimes we refer to grief as a her, personifying grief, because she's such a big thing that it feels better to talk about her, and is healthier that way too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, Megan, you gave us a lot there. There's a lot to sort of.
People don't talk about grief very often, so it feels nice to share what I've learned over the years. Yeah. No, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you can share it, and that we can engage in this conversation. This is so cool. I think there were a bunch of things you said there. Number one of the very first things I wrote down from what you just said is accepting feelings. You must accept your feelings, in order to even begin grieving. Did I get that right? Yeah. Man, I think that becomes so much more complicated, like you said, right now, because for some people, like for me, I'm a pretty introverted person. I love having conversations and being with people, but I'm in the Enneagram language, very much a 9, in the sense that like I'm very in touch with my internal self at all times. And so it feels very natural to be aware and constantly accepting my feelings. But acknowledging that's not the case for a lot of people, probably even most people. Yeah. And so that is so enlightening to me, to put that kind of context on all of the people acting out, as you said, all of
the adults who are struggling with resiliency, to use your terminology there. I guess, and maybe this is something we can talk about, but like, I don't know how does one go about accepting feelings if they don't have the community necessarily always present to allow them to get past that stage? I mean, I don't know. What does it even look like right now?
Good question. And chances are they won't, is the hard thing. And that's not something that can be changed without individual conversations, because it is weak. I mean, can you imagine President Trump coming on and saying, this is really hard. It's hard to do this, and I'm feeling frustrated with everyone because we see it. He, of all people, expresses the feelings, but he doesn't name them.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah.
So how do you do that? And let me tell you a story about one of the grandpas I work with. So I work with a foster kiddo, and his grandpa is fostering him. This grandpa is an ex-con, and I work with really interesting people, and so
yeah.
So he's an ex-con, and a rough one at that. And so he's tatted all over his body and smoked his entire life and done drugs for most of it too. And so he comes in, and I'm teaching him how to help his fourth grader have feelings, because this fourth grader acts like a second grader, younger than maybe kindergartner, because he's never been taught how to have feelings. He's taken care of his siblings his whole life. And now grandpa is being forced to be the one to teach him about feelings. And grandpa's going, I don't have feelings. I look at him and I say, you do. I don't have feelings. You do. And so a lot of it is just even dealing with that inner being that says that, because we all have that, don't we? We all have that inside that's like, I'm not doing that. Yes, you will. No, I'm not. And then eventually you accept that through hitting walls that you can't pass without accepting that, or through losing relationships because you are stuck in a phase that you can't get out of. And that was true for this grandpa too. He has accepted feelings, and he's one of my favorite people to work with now, because Miss Meghan tells me I have to work on my feelings. I don't like to work on my feelings. And you know what? We're all a little bit like that. I don't like to work with them, but I've gotta, and I have to. And
I don't like to work with them, but I gotta. What a great mindset.
But if we all had that mindset, wouldn't we be a little bit happier? Because we'd stop blaming other people for the feelings we don't want to deal with.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah,
it is. We blame others when we have a feeling we feel angry about, because we don't want to deal with it ourselves.
It's true.
Yeah. So I'm in a different spot than Adam is in. Like I feel like I am in touch with like what's going on inside for the most part, but I feel like when there's like a really intense negative feeling, I just try to move past it as much as I can. Like I think, okay, if I can just focus on the bright side, if I can find greener pastures, I'm gonna be okay. I don't have to sit with this. I don't have to acknowledge it, and I'm very much like, let's just keep going, and things are gonna get better. And
Will, even what you just said is called positive talk. That's a coping skill. You are resilient because you have coping skills. What you just said, I'm going to be okay, I will work through this, is something most people that we're watching don't even have.
You're blowing my mind right now.
You know what's great about this is that really all we've done is trick Meghan into coming in and counseling us. Isn't this great?
Free counseling. Sweet.
You're welcome. Saved you $800 an hour.
Yeah. Yeah, really, we should be paying you for this.
So I think that, okay, so maybe I'm more better at this than I thought. But I think that I in the past, I know that I have chosen to, I've refused to name the grief. And it was like when Rachel and I were going through premarital counseling, we were kind of dealing with the ways that we were both living with our parents before we got married, and pretty much had always lived with our parents. I lived at school for a year, but that was it. And so for Rachel, it was like really hard to think about moving out of her parents' house and moving on from that season of life, and moving on from being just in like around them all the time. And for me, I was just like, nope, marriage is going to be way better. I don't care. I was like, and my counselor was like trying to get me to realize that, like, hey, you need to acknowledge that that's going to hurt, like that's going to actually kind of stink. And when I actually allowed myself to sit in that for a minute and acknowledge, like, hey, this is hard, it was like, I mean, it was a game changer, because there in the past, like, I've moved on from I've moved on from one season of life to another, but like refused to grieve some of the changes that go with that. And every now and again, those pop up, and they hurt, and they just feel like unprocessed wounds, unhealed wounds. And so, like, I mean, there really is value in naming the grief and allowing yourself to feel it and experience it and go through it, instead of just pretending like it isn't there, and that there's something better down the road that is going to cover it up.
And Will, that's a great point to make, because you can move through life and through the changes without naming the grief. But what you lose is an acceptance of the good and an acceptance of the hard. And with that, you lose a quality of enjoyment of life that doesn't happen unless you name what's happening. So if you're moving from stage to stage, you're ignoring half of the feelings. And that's kind of the joy of life, right? Is to have all the different feelings and have the different experiences, and you're only getting half at most of the real experience of each season, including this quarantine season that we're in, if you don't acknowledge it, because otherwise you're stuck with one aspect of your feelings, likely anger, likely annoyance at all the people that are trying to sit with it, because aren't we all a little bit annoyed with people who over talk about things that they're struggling with or experiencing? And I'm not saying to be one of those people. None of us like those people. But what I am saying is, if you don't sit with your feelings, you can move on, and you will be okay. People have done it for years, particularly men have done it for years. Women have done a better job of this just because it's more socially acceptable. And that's not me being sexist. That's science.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, but men too will have more enjoyment of whatever season they're in because of what they name, and will end up learning the skill of resiliency, because that is something that you're born with, but it is something you can learn as well, by practicing sitting. That's the first time you accept your feelings, particularly with grief. It's going to be the longest, and it's going to be the most painful until it becomes easier, and then it gets easier, and then it gets shorter, the time that you have to grieve and transition.
Wow.
That's awesome. I think, as believers also, we have this benefit of having some really solid hope attached to that, because there is some risk of entering into grief because often I know in certain situations I can be afraid to sit in something or touch past pain or engage with it, because I know, oh man, that's gonna hurt, like that's gonna hurt really bad. And why would I want to dive into that if I didn't have some kind of hope on the other side? And you said this right near the beginning of the podcast, Megan, but like, how do people who aren't believers, do this on a regular basis? How are they surviving right now? Because they don't have the hope that has been promised to us. That's something I think I cling to. There's a couple of verses in Romans, but obviously the one that I think people quote a lot is Romans 12:12, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. This idea that there is hope. And so, we're being asked to be hopeful for what has been promised to come. I think that's a something that like we should be doing. We should be taking advantage of the hope that we've been promised, because it's there and it's real. That's something I think God is probably using this season for a lot of folks, is drawing them in and sort of kind of forcing them to rely on him and hope in him during this time.
Have you ever been on a mission trip where you see people in poverty that seem to have such a better relationship with God and seem to be so much more in touch with God than you ever imagined possible?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that to be because they have to rely on Christ. And in this time, you see even Christians, those crazy pastors that are like, we will open our doors on this date, whether you condone it or not. And first of all, obviously that goes against what we believe as the church doesn't have to be in a physical building. It's the body of Christ wherever we are worshiping, however God calls us to. We, as the church, are called to sit in that and are called to sit in the hope that Christ has had and sit with God as he is our only hope and strength. And I think that as America, we're a little bit shocked by how we thought we were doing that and are constantly smacked in the face by how we aren't. especially in this time when it just doesn't feel good that we can't do a single thing about this. We have no control over this.
Yeah.
And, the government thinks they do, but I think that's clear that they don't. And, no matter what they set in place, something changes. And we can make plans all we want, and those change too. And really the only one that knows what's going on and has any kind of control over this is Christ. And having to literally every day surrender that to Christ is a taste of what people all over the world have to do every day.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. When I think of I think about Paul and I think not many people suffered the ways that he suffered, the amount that he suffered, being stoned, shipwrecked, and, imprisoned. And there's even some moments, there's even things that Paul went through that we don't know about, that he references in scripture. And one of those is his experience in Asia that he talks about in the beginning of 2 Corinthians. And I might be wrong. Maybe we do know what happened, but I don't think so. And he says this, 2 Corinthians 1:8, for we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. And he will, I guess that was all of it. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect illustration of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's like this is an opportunity to I guess enter into that that grief, even though it is scary and painful, and know that God is in it with us, and he's carrying us through it, and there is hope in the end. And I mean, Paul says this was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. I love the perspective he puts it in, is like how powerful God is. Like, how dare you rely on yourself when there's literally God who raises people from the dead? So I mean, there's a big opportunity here, a big opportunity to learn to rely on God.
And why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we enter into that grief? And I want to clarify too, there's a difference between being willing to enter in when you haven't had a physical loss of someone you love and care for. That's a whole other conversation, because that's hard. I don't know how a lot of people do that. But I watch, I've had kindergartners through sixth graders lose a parent, both parents, grandparents, primary caregivers, after being given up by their mom, and they don't have Christ. And they still willingly enter into talking about grief, not knowing if there's hope on the other side of that. For Christians, why wouldn't you enter into talking about your grief when you know that there's only hope on the other side, and only Christ that is with you in that? To me, that feels like the most joyful experience that there could be, because you get to understand yourself more. You understand those around you more. You end up with more empathy, and you end up, most importantly, closer to Christ in the end, and have a better understanding of the hope that he brings. So just having that in perspective of people who are choosing to enter into grief without that hope on the other side is pretty astounding, that not all Christians do it. So
wow, that's really good. I can't think of a better way to sort of, that's like the perfect bow on this whole conversation. Man, that's wonderful.
I'm still kind of just like processing all of this.
This was
like,
a
it's
lot.
also good. This is like.
Is there some way? I don't even know. I have so many different notes here. We usually like to, Megan, we like to try to end these episodes by sort of condensing what we've learned and what we've talked about into like just a few really key points. We've hit on so many big things here. I think what you just really neatly tied up, what we've been talking about, and why not enter in hope. The hope is there. That's definitely something I think is really key takeaway for me. I know coming out of this conversation, and I think as a good challenge. Why not? We should be entering into those things, and because we have been promised everything in Christ, and so why not enter in, even though it's scary, even though it might be painful.
And just
go ahead, please.
Just a reminder that even with Christ, grief still looks different for everybody, because everyone grieves differently and everyone has a different set of skills. And it's important to grieve in the way that you and Christ feel is necessary to grieve, to move past, to move along with what you were dealing with. So.
Yeah. And one of those ways, like you were saying, is accepting your feelings with, again, whatever that looks like for the individual, but find a way to move towards accepting the feelings that you're having to become resilient. I don't know, Will, do you have something specific?
I feel like if we're gonna give people like a next step, if we're gonna give them 3 or any amount of next steps, I think that like I think we got to go backwards a little bit, and where we start is we need to know what God promises us and know the hope that we have. And I think we need to sit in that first, and know and understand that, and let that permeate our minds, I think, before we can say, oh, I have hope in Jesus, because it's an easy thing to say, and it's kind of a typical Christian term. But I think one like real concrete step for people is figure out what that is. Figure out what it is that God does promise you, whether or not you believe it right now. What does God promise? What is the hope that we have?
Yeah, and if people want at least one verse to start with, I already gave the Romans 12 verse, but in Romans 8, 22 through 25, there's some stuff there to look through. That's where the scripture says, not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoptions as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. That is concretely, I think that is the thing we are hoping for, is the redemption of our bodies and that promise that we're given through Christ.
Mm-hmm. I feel like this is a conversation and a topic that is nearly impossible to boil down. And I think that it is a little more complicated than most to put it into 3 concrete steps as we typically do. But Meghan, is there any like practical next step that we can give our listeners, whether that is maybe their friend is going through a loss of some sort, or maybe that, something for themselves, whether that's the loss of an experience, a graduation, a wedding, missing their friends, or the loss of a family member, something like that. Is there any practical step that we can give them to take?
Sure. Kind of similar to what I said before, it doesn't matter who you are. And, some people have experienced bigger grief in this time than others, but it doesn't make one person's grief more real than another's. Mm-hmm. So I would say the first step is to sit with your feelings, because and forgive me, I work with primarily non-Christians, and so the idea, I'm new to tying this conversation into hope with Christ, not for myself, but in terms of talking about it with others. Which is a really interesting thing as someone who's been a Christian my whole life. I'm like, wow, okay, I didn't realize that I've never talked with other Christians about grief before. So I would say for Christians and non-Christians alike, the first step is to just, like I said, acknowledge that there is a feeling, and just sit with that. And I would encourage you to sit with it with somebody else, because it's a lot harder to acknowledge that you have a feeling to somebody else than it is to just sit with it alone. And it's a lot emptier that way too. Feels uncomfortable, but it feels a lot better once you find a safe person that can sit with you in that feeling.
Yeah,
that's great.
Awesome.
Well,
Meghan, thank you so much. Oh my gosh.
Yes. I
think this is going to be really helpful for people. I mean, it's helpful for me. I know there's definitely some feelings that I need to go sit in for a little while. So yeah, I'm just going to go into the corner and curl up in a ball and
with somebody else.
Okay. I'll let Rachel know
that's
going to happen. So yeah, thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you on.
Absolutely.
I'm really glad I got to meet you.
Yeah,
you too.
It's my joy to share you with the world, Meghan. I'm so proud of you as a friend. You're so wonderful.
Thanks, Adam. It feels like college all over again. We used to
That's right.
talk all the time.
Yeah, right.
Oh yeah, that I don't think we tell everyone how you knew each other.
No.
His
Oh, well.
wife's one of my very best friends. So
Yeah.
and we went to college.
And you guys
together.
met at college, right? At
Yep,
Taylor?
we met at college. Yep.
Yep.
Nice.
Adam's a
Nice.
dear friend of mine. So
Mm-hmm.
Rock and roll. All right. Well, we're about out of time. Thank you guys for listening to The Daily Commute. You can connect with us on Facebook by going to The Daily Commuters or Instagram at @TheDaily_Commuters. If you're a visual person, we are on YouTube. We're recording this right now through Zoom. So you can find the link to our YouTube channel through any of our social media pages. If you have a question or a topic that you'd like us to talk about, you can send us an email at askdailycommute@gmail.com or just send us a DM. Adam, do you have any fatherly advice to leave us with today?
Yes, I do. Always groom your dogs. I gotta remember to prepare for that question. I'm never ready.
Was that the first thing that came into your head? Always groom your dogs? You don't even have a dog.
I know. I don't know. I panicked, and that was the first thing I thought of.
All right, guys. Well, we'll see you next time.